The American Colonies, Moving Toward Independence, Part 2. And our first subtopic is the Townsend Acts. The Townsend Acts. The American Colonies, Moving Towards Independence, Part 2. And the first subtopic is the Townsend Acts. Anybody want to guess who the Townsend Acts were named after? Named after Riley Wagner? No, after who? Charles Townsend. Anybody want to guess who Charles Townsend is going to be? Come on, dig deep. How could you have laws or acts named after you? What position would you have to hold for that? He was the new Prime Minister of Great Britain. He was elected in 1767. And he replaced George Grenville as Prime Minister of Great Britain. So, in 1767, Parliament came under new leadership with the election of Charles Townsend as Prime Minister. And shortly after his election, Prime Minister Townsend convinced Parliament to place another tax on the American colonies. So shortly after he became Prime Minister, Charles Townsend convinced Parliament to place another tax on the American colonies. Now this tax is going to affect every single colonist, where the other taxes sometimes only affected merchants, right? Do you remember the act in which colonial merchants had to pay tax on all items imported outside of Great Britain? They didn't like that, right? Well, this particular tax will be similar, only it'll be a tax that every colonist will have to pay for items imported from Great Britain. So kind of like a sales tax in essence, right? So this new act that Prime Minister Charles Townsend convinced Parliament to pass would be a tax to all colonists of items of everyday use that came from Great Britain. So anything that was imported in from Great Britain is going to have a tax on it for every single colonist to pay. Sort of like a sales tax in Wyoming, right? You go down to Blair's and buy a piece of chicken for lunch, are you going to pay tax on that? Yeah, same. It's a very same type of concept, okay? Now, the reason that Charles Townsend put this tax into play is because he wanted to, gain important revenue to get the British government out of debt, right? That's the whole goal here. This debt hasn't gone away, has it? They still owe a huge debt because of the 4 wars they fought, especially the French and Indian War. So the tax would help gain important revenue into the British government to help pay off their huge debt. And as I mentioned, this would affect all American colonists, not just merchants. Now, to be honest with you, I was kind of surprised the American colonists kind of accepted this idea. They didn't put up much fight about the fact that they were going to be taxed on every item coming in from Great Britain. They really didn't put up a fight at first. Well, Parliament decided that they were going to clean up the smuggling once and for all. So when they passed this new tax, their concern was, as it was before, that they would try to smuggle these goods past the tax collectors and not pay their tax. And so what Parliament did, it's like kind of when you're a leader of a school. We always put rules in because we think something's going to happen, or Maddie's going to do, I think she's going to do this, so let's put the rule in. Well, my thought is, let's wait till she does it to prove that it's true, and then we'll do it. But you ever notice how we do that preventative action before anybody ever does anything wrong? Well, Parliament kind of jumped the gun, thinking that the American colonists would rebel against this tax and try to smuggle goods in. Parliament passed something called the Writs of Assistance. Very important term. They passed the Writs of Assistance, which is on your ID sheet. So, surprisingly, the American colonists accepted the idea of these new taxes. However, Parliament decided to try to clean up the prior smuggling issues by passing a new law called the Writs of Assistance. Anybody have any idea what they are? We have them today. We have them today. They're a little bit different today than they were then. But we actually have, law enforcement has writs of assistance. What do we call them today? Think about smuggling and what you'd have to do to prevent it. What were the writs of assistance, in essence, today? Search warrants. Exactly right. So these writs of assistance were simply modern-day search warrants, but not the same. Same concept, not exactly the same. Now, in today, why would a police officer get a search warrant, Carter?
So they can search someone's property.
Okay, why would they want to search their, you're right, why would they want to search their property?
Maybe evidence of a crime.
Okay, which means they have what in there? What do they have that allows them to get a search warrant?
Suspicious.
Probable cause. So, and I'm talking, don't write this down, we're just making an explanation. In today's search warrant, a police officer has to have probable cause to think that a crime's being committed before they can search. Once they get probable cause and get the search warrant, what's in the search warrant? The exact thing they're looking for and the place it's supposed to be. So, there's a rumor that there's a marijuana sales going on in Johnny Jones's house in town. And they've got probable cause that's happening. And it's being done right in his kitchen. So they get a search warrant to search for marijuana in his kitchen of his house. If they go in there and find stolen guns in the bedroom, can they prosecute him on that? No, but they're probably going to go get another search warrant as quick as they can to do that before he gets the guns out. That's today's society. Now here's the difference. These search warrants, called the writs of assistance, gave British officials the legal right to search for smuggled goods without probable cause. Okay? They just had free reign. They could enter any vessel, any warehouse, any private home, anytime they wanted, ransack the place and leave it a mess with the hope of finding something. They have no probable cause. Does that make sense? They just think that Andy must have smuggled some stuff in. Look at the way she's looking at me. You know she smuggled stuff in. So they get this writ of assistance, and they just go ransack her home, and they don't find anything. That's okay. Make a mess of the place. You can't do that now. You see the difference between a legal search warrant now and then? Well, as you can imagine, these search warrants, after giving British officials the legal right to search for smuggled goods in the American colonies without probable cause, caused some problems. You think people wanted you coming into their homes when they're probably law-abiding citizens, never thought of smuggling a thing in their life, and now you're going to ransack their home just because you have rumor that there might be some in there? Or you don't even know of rumor, you just don't trust anybody, right? So you're going to ransack every home on Block A in Massachusetts because they might have smuggled goods, and you have this very loyal British American colonist who's very loyal to the British, who never would break a law in their life. They're getting their house turned upside down. Well, that caused resistance. Okay? The tax didn't get the colonists upset. The writs of assistance got the colonists upset. And I'm going to give you 3 different ways that American colonists protested the writs of assistance and examples of each. Okay? I'm going to give you 3 different ways that American colonists protested the writs of assistance and examples of each. Now please, kiddos, don't get the reason tied up with the example. Okay? I'm going to give you 3 different ways they protested the writs of assistance. Don't get the way mixed up with the example of the way. See what I mean? Okay, the first way American colonists protested the writs of assistance was through peaceful protest. They did it through peaceful protest. Now I'm going to give you some examples of peaceful protest. First of all, who issues a search warrant if a police officer wants one today? Judge. Very good. Well, do you think that when they wanted a search warrant or a writ of assistance, do you think they called all the way, got on the phone and called all the way back to the judges in Great Britain and said, hey, I got to have me a writ of assistance here? Who did they get those from? Where were the judges located? Where did they get these from? Colonies, right? Well, one way to peacefully protest the writs of assistance is these colonial judges would do what? They wouldn't give them the search warrant. They wouldn't issue it. Okay, does that make sense? If the judge doesn't issue it, and sometimes police officers want a search warrant for something, they go to the judge, and the judge doesn't think they have enough probable cause, so they don't give them the search warrant. Well, in this case, you didn't have to have probable cause, so they just expected to walk into the colonial judge chambers and get a writ of assistance without any explanation, right, Mackenzie? Well, these guys just said, we're not giving you one. So that was one way to peacefully protest it, is colonial courts refused to issue the writs. Remember the old Quartering Act of 1765 where they were responsible to feed and house soldiers? One way they peacefully protested is they decided they wouldn't abide by that anymore. They would not abide by the Quartering Act of 1765. They would not provide food and shelter for British soldiers. They just said, no, we're not going to do it. That was one way to peacefully protest the writs of assistance. What might be another way you might protest? Anybody have a way you might protest this peacefully? What might you do? You don't like the new cell phone policy. How would you protest that peacefully? How would you protest that peacefully? Mike, Daniel, you go make up a bunch of flyers and put them on the lockers saying, if you're against the cell phone policy, why don't you sign my petition stating you'd like to see the rule changed? So they put up pamphlets, not on lockers, but on pamphlets up on fences or posts or wherever, and had people sign petitions against the writs of assistance. Now, what's a good thing about a petition? Okay, look. What's a petition mean? If you want the cell phone policy changed and you were get a petition, what's the purpose of the petition?
Just so that you have enough people to show that they're happy.
Yeah, okay, and who would you give that to?
Probably Parliament.
Okay, in this school though, who would you give it to? Who's the parliament?
Sanford.
You give it to Mr. Sanford. Well, then Mr. Sanford would have to look at that petition, decide whether he wanted to change his mind or not, right? Sometimes how do people decide that? If I get a petition signed by a bunch of people I don't like, what are the chances of me changing that rule? Zero. When I was a principal in my day, if a kid that was a really good student and a non-complainer came and said, gee, I think really you're screwed up by this policy, I might be more apt to listen to that person than the one that complained about every single rule you had. So that's the danger or good thing about petitions, but that's what they did. They put up advertising pamphlets and issued petitions for signatures voicing displeasure over the writs of assistance. But what was the key one, Regan? What did they do that worked so good for them the last time when they wanted to protest the Stamp Act? It was a key word. It was worth 6 points on your test. What did they do again? Non-importation agreements. They re-signed, colonial merchants re-signed new non-importation agreements. That's going to be the big peaceful protest, because didn't that work pretty good in the Stamp Act? We'll see if it works again in the Townsend Acts. Okay? So they reissued, colonial merchants reissued those non-importation agreements. So that is the first way that American colonists protested the writs of assistance, and examples of each. We okay on that? Okay, the second way was through Colonial Assembly. The second way they protested was through Colonial Assembly. Anybody know what that is? Okay, what's Colonial Assembly? Anybody?
They would gather and...
Okay, who's gathering? The assembly actually was the name for each colony's. Remember, they all had separate governments. So colonial assemblies were colonial governments. That's another way they protested the writs of assistance, was through their colonial assemblies or governments. I'll give you some examples. What happened is the governments of all 13 colonies got together. They convened at a place and they protested the writs of assistance as a group. Each colony represented. Does that make sense? So they used their assemblies, they used their governments. Each colony, remember, they had separate governments, right? They got together to discuss what they were going to do about these writs of assistance. And how this got started is a guy by the name of Samuel Adams, who led the Massachusetts Assembly, had sent letters to all the other colonies and urged them to get together against the writs of assistance. So he's the one that initiated these guys getting all together as a group to unite. So again, Samuel Adams, who led the Massachusetts Assembly, or in other words, the government of Massachusetts, he had written letters to all of the 13 colonial assemblies and said, let's band together and meet and talk about the protest of these writs of assistance. Is that making sense? The question is, how do they get together? What do they do when they get together to protest those? They wrote resolutions. They wrote resolutions. And all 13 assemblies agreed to these resolutions. Does anybody know what a resolution is? Go ahead.
I believe they're going to solve the problem.
You're very close. It's a statement of your opinion. We're against the writs of assistance. It's your will. What's your will? This is why I'm against it. And my intent is to do this. Now guess who wrote the first resolution against the writs of assistance? Head of the Virginia Assembly, George Washington. So once they got together, George Washington, who was the leader of the Virginia Assembly, wrote a set of resolutions against the Townsend Acts, or against the writs of assistance. George Washington, once they got together, who was the leader of the Virginia Assembly before he ever became general or president, wrote a set of resolutions against these writs of assistance and the Townsend Acts. Now again, I want to make sure you understand a resolution. A resolution is where you state your opinion on the controversy, your will, why you feel like you do about it, and your intent of what you're going to do about it. Okay? So again, a resolution is a statement of your opinion on the problem, why, your will, why you think it's a problem, and your intent, what you're going to do about the problem. So they wrote these resolutions, Washington did, on what they were going to propose to do about the writs of assistance, and all 13 assemblies adopted his resolutions. His statement of opinion, his will, how he felt about the writs, and what their intention was to do to get them to be stopped. Put this all together in a resolution, all 13 assemblies adopted. That was the second way that American colonists protested the writs of assistance, was through colonial assemblies. Luke Mortimer, what's the third way? The funnest way. They did it, they protested not peacefully, but through revolution or violently. Okay? So they didn't protest peacefully, they protested by revolution. Revolutionary approach is what they took. A revolutionary approach. So just so we back up, the first reason was through peaceful protest. Second reason, Colonial Assembly. Third reason, revolutionary approach. And then I'm going to give you examples of that. Revolutionary approach. What might you do, Riley? What might you do to do a revolutionary approach against this? You can tie a little bit into the Sons of Liberty. What might you do? Who's checking those ships coming in to make sure the taxes are paid? British patrol ships, right? So the first thing these guys did, the American colonists, is they boarded those custom ships and damaged them. Boarded the custom ships and damaged them. So American colonists boarded those custom ships and damaged them. What they do to the British officials that were on those ships, Daniel?
They poured tar into their...
No, they assaulted them.
Oh.
They were going to give them these. They assaulted British officials, custom officials, assaulted them. Now, Daniel, once they assault those British officials, what did Parliament do to protect those British officials that were being assaulted?
They
Brought in the army, right?
Yeah.
And then they assaulted the army too. So they boarded vessels and damaged custom ships that belonged to Britain. They assaulted British custom officials. They assaulted the British soldiers who were sent to protect the custom officials. Now we'll get back to what Daniel said. Who'd they tar and feather? Who'd they tar and feather? Nope. Who'd they, what? Loyalists. They tarred and feathered those snitches that had told on them that they were smuggling. If they caught any snitches that were getting reward money, they would tar and feather snitches. So don't put on the test, don't put they tar and feathered colonists. They tarred and feathered snitches that were getting reward money for turning them in. Then they started calling the British soldiers names. You believe that? Insulting them. And I'm going to ask you this, Bailey, because you're fitting right in today. What did they refer them to as? What did they call them? It was not very complimentary. You fit in good with it today. They called them redcoats, because their coats, their army coats, they call them redcoats. A lot of people think that was widely accepted by the British military. They liked being called redcoats. They did not. That was a slam. They also called them lobsters, because their uniform in their mind looked like kind of like the shell of a lobster. And they even went as low to call them bloodybacks. Bloodybacks and redcoats and lobsters. My God. And you know what they even did, Regan? When the weather was good, they threw rocks at them. And when the weather was bad, they threw snowballs at them. That's right, snowballs, probably with rocks in them. So those are some examples of the revolutionary approach. Boarding British custom ships causing damage, assaulting British custom officials, assaulting the soldiers who came to protect those officials, tar and feathering any colonists who had informed British officials about smuggling, snitches, started taunting the British soldiers, calling them lobsters and redcoats and bloodybacks, and they even threw stones and snowballs at the British soldiers. And you think that's pretty childish, don't you, Kate? That they're throwing snowballs. But you know what that action, those last two actually ended up leading to something famous in American history. You know what it was? That's how it started, by throwing